Felharathna, that was the name of this world with a red sky. One person had been chosen as the chosen one, and was given the mission to survive in that place to become the strongest of all. In that place, a monstrous dog tries to bite a human who, in an attempt to push it away, causes both of them to roll down a hill. Once on the ground, the boy wonders what is happening, as he doesn't understand where he is, and he's even puzzled by the strange form of the dog. He doesn't have much time to think because the hound lunges at him. However, our main character reacts quickly and strikes it with a large stone. In his mind, the boy admits that the only thing he knows for certain is that if he doesn't kill the dog, he will be the one to die. The hound gets up, despite having a broken jaw, and still tries to approach to bite him. All of this confuses the young man, who doesn't understand why he wants to harm it. Suddenly, a yellow screen appears in front of him, a guide, which provides him with information about the dog. It was a level 1 monster called Infernal Dog, which had strength equivalent to that of an adult man, even though it was the weakest monster in Felharathna. Additionally, it explains that the player's level could increase by gaining more experience from defeating monsters. This further confuses the boy, who questions whether he is trapped in some fantasy game world. While reading, the Infernal Dog places its snout on his neck, about to bite him. The protagonist wonders when things went so wrong. He was previously in his bed, waking up late, just like he had done every day since being discharged from mandatory military service 3 months ago. Wondering what he could do that day to pass the time, he sees his military uniform and his real name, Ryu Hanbin. He admits that he believed that after completing his service, he would start to become a part of society. However, nothing had changed in him despite serving for 2 years in the military. The last few months had been nothing more than a black fog, and that was his reality, sitting in front of his computer, eating snacks, completely bored. But as he browsed the internet, black smoke begins to envelop the protagonist in a disturbing way, causing him to scream. Almost instantly, Ryu Hanbin disappears from the chair he was sitting in, leaving no trace. In a new space, a voice comments that all the chosen ones had been gathered. Another voice questions if they were all there, as they had heard that there were 7 billion candidates. Ryu looks around in confusion, surrounded by many women and men who, like him, are naked, but covered in a strange light that prevents him from seeing them. Unaware of the origin of the voices, he wonders if it is God who is speaking. The voices continue to discuss. One explains that it was fair because they had 7 billion candidates, which allowed them to find so many chosen ones, a sentiment echoed by the second voice. It then instructs them to transmit the guide to all the players, which surprises the other voice, questioning whether it would be too artificial to do so. Upon hearing this, Ryu confirms that the voice is not God. Unaware of his thoughts, the voice responds that this decision serves as motivation and helps them assess their situation, something they had already tested with the previous chosen ones. Still doubtful, the other voice accepts it, and the transmission of the guide begins. As they do this, all the people fall toward a light. However, the protagonist, in particular, is pierced by a sword of light, causing him to groan in pain. This is noticed by a voice that laments, saying it made a mistake, which prompts Ryu to curse at it. It seems that the presence made a mistake with the guide. Nonetheless, it downplays the importance of it happening with just one person. As Ryu Hanbin falls, the voice indicates that he is the chosen one, number 398, and his dimensional transport will begin soon. Thus, the protagonist understands that he has been selected as a chosen one. Returning to the present, Ryu is on top of the Infernal Dog, using the stone with which he previously struck it to crush its skull, hoping that it is now dead. Then, an announcement appears before him, indicating that by killing the Infernal Dog, he gained 13 experience points. Although Ryu doesn't see this, and continues to attack the dog's corpse, he wonders if this is his reality now, and if so, what will happen to his previous life, his parents, and what will happen to him. Feeling helpless, he throws the stone he used as a weapon to the side and hits the ground, feeling bad about going through this when he was discharged just 3 months ago and couldn't even go out with a girl. As he is about to cry, a new screen appears in front of him, warning him that he has less than a 5% chance of surviving in Felharathna. After reading the entire guide, Ryu begins to laugh maniacally, wondering if he is being tested, as the end of the warning poses the question of whether he wants to end his life directly. Wondering if some people kidnapped him to abandon him in a new world, Ryu approaches the screen. But when it seemed like he was going to accept, he falls to the ground, wondering if they would send him back home if he died there. He automatically dismisses this possibility, as he doesn't believe he would have been kidnapped if that were their plan. Therefore, accepting that it would be his end if he died in that space, he gets up, choosing to find a way to survive and escape from there. As he stands up, determined, the screen indicates that he, the Chosen One, has discovered his will and fighting spirit, which is why his strength has increased. In front of the protagonist, several interconnected screens appear, asking him to select an ability, which makes him smile, knowing that it will be useful. The first option was Warrior, a melee combat class that could use various techniques and had aura as a resource. Ryu dismisses this, commenting while looking at the dog's corpse that this kind of combat was only fun in games. That's why he prefers a ranged combat style and looks at the Mage option, a class that could control 6 magic attributes and use magic as a resource. However, when he chooses it, the guide rejects him, indicating that he lacks the capabilities for that class. So, Ryu opts for the Magic Swordsman, but is rejected again. He tries choosing Healer and Priest but is rejected as well, so with a tear running down his face, he selects the Warrior class without any other option. Now it's time for him to choose his weapon, and wanting to keep a distance from his enemies, he selects the long spear, but the guide gives him the long sword, saying that's what he chose. Of course, he complains about this, but the system indicates that it is experiencing several errors and disappears without further explanation. This makes Ryu remember when he was hit by that beam of light, and the voice mentioned that it made a mistake with the guide. This worries him even more because the guide seemed to be the only useful thing in that desolate place. As he kneels, Ryu starts laughing, thinking that he hates acting according to what those who put him there want. Nevertheless, he takes his sword and, thinking that it's at least better than a rock, he emphasizes that he won't die in that place. Thus, he begins his infernal life, leveling up. Later, he is seen trying to use the sword to attack, but it is so heavy that he ends up falling and shedding a tear, feeling sad. 7 years had passed since Ryu arrived in Thelharafna. At that moment, he was fighting an infernal dog, who managed to strike him and take advantage of the distraction to escape. These were the monsters he always faced, although they usually leveled up to adapt to him, like this green dog that was now at level 2. But this leveling up didn't seem to be just about power. Ryu noticed how that dog used the moment he brandished his sword to attack, showing that these beings were also learning from him. Without thinking much, he strikes at the dog with his sword. However, the protagonist failed in his attack, and the dog didn't even have to move. Because of this, Ryu declares that he's bad with a sword while the monster mocks him. After this, the dog takes advantage of his opponent's bad position to attack from the front. But Ryu quickly raises his sword and with a swift frontal strike, he finishes it off. By defeating that level 2 infernal dog, Ryu gains 22 experience points, adding up to a score of 262, with only 18 points needed to level up. This attack was Stab, an ability he obtained upon reaching level 2, which he could activate with ease, despite not being an expert in sword usage. That night, inside a cave, the protagonist comments that one of the uses of the guide is to indicate certain components of his resources. He discovered that the infernal dog could be considered perfect food since its cooked meat had essential fats and amino acids, and its blood contained carbohydrates, fibers, and minerals that made it an essential drink. All of this confirms to the protagonist that he is now in a virtual world, and he is sure there must be a reason why he was brought to this place, and there must be a way to escape since it wouldn't make sense to just leave him trapped for no reason. In that moment, he recalls when the voices mention the 7 billion candidates, and he wonders what will happen to the other chosen ones. Then, his guide informs him that he will be able to leave the Rocky Mountains, the safe zone he is currently in, where the mortality rate is much lower once he reaches level 5, and there he will meet the rest of the chosen ones. Then, when he reaches level 20, he will be able to explore the entire map of Thelharafna and uncover its secrets. These revelations, although they provide answers to some questions, disturb Ryu because he doesn't understand what he should do in this continent of Thelharafna, and when he asks for answers from his guide, it experiences another error that halts its information. Nevertheless, knowing that this zone was designed for players to level up confirms his theory that the infernal dogs increase their power over time. However, Ryu accepts that he cannot blindly trust his guide, so he decides that he will seek more information from other players once he finds them after leaving that place. After this, our protagonist began going out directly to hunt the infernal dogs. It wasn't easy since the monsters were even stronger than him, so he always chose to face them individually. This way, he managed to reach level 3. Obtaining a new ability, Side Slash, which helped him confront the new infernal dogs, which had strength similar to that of an unarmed novice warrior. Thus began a routine for Ryu Hanbin, which consisted of kill, eat, sleep, fight, get injured, kill, over and over until he finally reached level 4. Although during a battle with an infernal dog that threw him far away, he showed that he had improved his skills overall, having the cleverness to use dirt to temporarily blind his enemy and finish it. It was in this last battle where the protagonist would obtain the experience points he needed to reach level 5, after 27 days of continuous hunting. This new power also manifested in the protagonist, making it easier for him to wield his sword and increasing the size of his muscles. Although this excited him, he was quickly overcome by despair when he saw that the guide indicated that his level, instead of rising, had dropped back to 1. Hoping that it was just an error, he checked his stats, only to confirm that he had indeed returned to level 1, even though he retained the skills he obtained when leveling up and the corresponding stats. He assumed that the level of the infernal dogs had also returned to 1, which would make it easier for him to collect experience. However, he tried to remain optimistic, but his disappointment only increased when he noticed that, despite what the guide indicated, these monsters had still increased their power. With few other options, he continued to put his life at risk by facing these infernal dogs, only to return to level 1 when he was supposed to reach level 5. With few other options, he continued to try until a couple of attempts turned into dozens, dozens turned into thousands, and thousands turned into hundreds of thousands. But nothing changed. The guide always gave an error and prevented him from progressing. Ryu continued to kill dogs without stopping, becoming much stronger in the process, developing a great muscular build and having an easier time winning despite the large size these monsters had acquired. In this way, 7 years passed, and he was stuck in this leveling cycle between 1 and 4. At least, he could maintain the increase in his stats, and his wounds healed every night, allowing him to unleash his full potential. However, he couldn't learn new abilities, as he couldn't pass level 4 either, and he was left with only 3, stab, side slash, and vertical slash. Looking dejected, Ryu returned to his cave after tossing the bones of a dog into a large pit. But from the hole, these bones came together to form a great beast that growled at him. Although he appeared undeterred, he claimed that the system didn't put these monsters there to help him, as it indicated, but rather they were there to be killed. Of course, while the bone monster lunged to attack with its fangs, the protagonist wondered how they could kill something that was already dead and stated that this was probably the question his kidnappers were asking about him. As he made this declaration, Ryu smiled maliciously, indicating the deteriorating state of his sanity. Parallel to this confrontation, an incorporeal figure examines various profiles of people of all types, thinking that it has completed the transmission of the guide to the chosen ones. So it was time to move on to the 5th Operation Jaren Rathna. Being the 5th time he had done this, he was accustomed to the process, so he was sure it would take players at least a year to complete this stage. Wishing for good players to emerge, he stretches, and when he is about to leave, he notices a pile of boxes that intrigue him. He approaches to see what it is, not understanding if it's a deleted or a broken one, so he finds the situation quite suspicious. He takes a card, which had Ryu Hanbin's face on it and indicated that he was currently connected to Thelha Rathna. Next, we see Ryu Hanbin with his arm outstretched, lying on his bed, groggy. He wonders if he had returned, which he obviously had since he had just been discharged, showing that he had forgotten everything about being transported to another world. Tired, he decides to sleep a little more, but a screen bothers him for this, and he is about to touch it. It was the screen that asked him if he wanted to end his own life. Ryu notices this and quickly gets up, preventing it from being touched, returning to Thelha Rathna. He was no longer a normal boy. He had a muscular body, and he was at the bottom of a cliff, with a dead infernal dog with his sword stuck in its throat. Then, he remembers where he really is. He had spent the last 10 years trying to survive by defeating all sorts of monsters. He realizes that he fell through that huge hole and yet survived thanks to his great power. However, he checks his guide and realizes that killing that infernal dog again brought him back to level 1 instead of leveling him up to level 5. Desperate, he begins to reflect on whether what he's doing is worth it and considers giving up, pressing the button to end his own life. But as he was about to do this, he reconsiders and gets up, wondering if he would really be sent home if he ended his life. The protagonist is aware of the slim chances of this, so he takes his sword and declares that if he dies, he will at least make it worthwhile. He also retains a distant desire to live that motivates him as well. Despite his optimism, the protagonist remained trapped in that place for another 10 years. With no results, after that, he stopped counting the days that passed, so he himself doesn't know how long he's been in the mountains since then. During this time, he ended up developing new hobbies, such as sculpting and collecting objects. Although it could be tough, that place left no room for idleness. Therefore, he decided to make the most of the countless bones he obtained from the infernal dogs to upgrade his basic sword into a much more prominent and powerful weapon, which, despite its large size, he could lift with ease using his muscular arms. If he couldn't change his situation, then he chose to do things he could improve his lifestyle, so he used items like bones, stones, and fabrics to create his own home and live every day with devotion. While Ryu was enjoying his new weapon, he gazed happily at the weather to which he had become accustomed, thinking that he had finally managed to free himself from his rage. But as soon as this idea was over, a giant infernal dog crushed his home in front of him with a single paw. It was a scene that shocked him and left him completely immobilized, which the monster took advantage of to strike him, creating a large cloud of smoke and shedding a large spurt of blood. The blood belonged to the same infernal dog that stayed in shock upon seeing that Ryu had cut its hand without even drawing his weapon. Angrily, the protagonist tells it that it took him 3 years to build his house, and as retaliation, he will now use its bones to build a palace, a statement that terrifies the infernal dog. The protagonist explains that these were the infernal dogs that were appearing to him now, large monsters that only made noise and didn't even fight well. So he put hunting them on the back burner, although spending so many years fighting them to the death allowed him to improve his winning strategy. Then, that beast takes flight and releases a great fire blast from the sky, a dragon's breath, which was its ultimate attack. Ryu couldn't do anything to dodge it, but he still showed a bored expression. After the attack, the infernal dog descends, confident, only to see that the protagonist had landed behind his large sword and used his body's strength to block the attack, a move that only managed to burn the tips of Ryu's hair, which he complains to the monster about. The infernal dog then decides to summon various rays of light and fire, which are easily blocked by a rock wall that the protagonist creates by cutting a large stone from the ground instantly. The infernal dog is left gaping at such superiority. To finish it off, Ryu leaps forward, ready to strike it, but his timing is wrong, so he ends up only cutting the monster's nails. Despite the time, he still hadn't become a true master of the sword, he admits. The infernal dog seizes this error and tries to eat him, but the protagonist doesn't stop and gives it a great kick from inside its mouth, breaking its jaw. Then he prepares to launch a new attack, using vertical slash, side slash, and stab in that order consecutively. Although he didn't manage to acquire a new ability, after more than 10,000 times he unleashed his power. He managed to combine his 3 abilities into one, creating a new power, Cross Impact, a triple cross attack that explodes the monster's body. While Ryu understands that it's not a real skill, no infernal dog has managed to get up after being hit with it. Back to that incorporeal figure, when he sees the image of Ryu Hanbin, he recognizes him as the guy who ended with an error. Concerned, he wonders why he was still in Felhar Rathna, remembering that the 5th generation is operating in Jaren Rathna, the 4th is in Rohar Rathna, so he realizes that he belongs to the 3rd generation, which arrived in Felhar Rathna. This means that Ryu Hanbin has been lost for 22 years. This worries him because that person might find out, and he couldn't come up with a credible excuse or kill him. Then he checks his guide and realizes he is at level 4, and his stats are very low. He doesn't understand how he had survived for so long with such low power, but the figure smiles maliciously, declaring that there was a way to deal with him. As night falls in the mountainous area, Ryu builds a fire to cook the infernal dog's meat while sitting on the monster's tail. He opens his stats to see the same ones that the figure saw, but he demands to see his real stats. Even though his level was the same, all his stats exceeded 1,000 points. Curiously, Ryu wonders what his true level would be. Then, he begins to think about how much longer he will be living like this, as he wanted to eat other things, talk to people, see more. Quickly, he tries to regain his optimism, thinking that someday he would manage to return home. Suddenly, a portal forms in the sky, and the guide indicates that he has completed the Felhar Rathna level. The figure was banging a board with a hammer, stating that he only had to erase him and all his records because he would die on the Rathna continent as a level 4. Then, the portal emits a beam of light that begins to destroy that world, to Ryu's surprise, finding it rather abrupt. The next thing you see is a lightning bolt striking a forested world, something a monstrous being, a dragon, notices from a distance, remarking how these beings from another world kept arriving. Looking at the blue sky, the green plants, Ryu is fascinated, happy to have left that mountain full of hellish rocks and starts walking around, jumping into the lake. This area was the Sathe Forest of the Greylet Kingdom, located in the north of the Rathna continent. Feeling more at ease, the protagonist begins to analyze his strange situation. He looks at his guide and is puzzled to see that he automatically became level 5 when transported to that place. He also learned a new skill, language translation, to communicate with any species without difficulty. Furthermore, there was the fact that he was supposed to reach level 20 to be taken to the Rathna continent, which worries him the most. As he continues to check his guide, he notices a new mission, the final mission, which asks him to kill one of the 6 goddesses of Rathna. What surprised and excited the protagonist the most were the rewards he would receive: eternal and immortal life, 3 wishes granted, and being sent back home with his status intact. Especially the latter was what interested him the most. Seeking more information, he found recommendations to keep his identity as a person from another world a secret and to register as a hunter in the Hunters Guild of the corporate city of Onpris. While processing all this new information, Ryu is startled by a roar. It was the white-haired, sky-blue-skinned dragon that had previously warned him of its presence. The dragon, angry, accuses him of wanting to enter its forest to face it with bare hands. Upon hearing this, the protagonist realizes he accidentally left his sword stuck by the river. Without giving him a chance to retrieve it, the dragon breathes blue fire that the protagonist manages to dodge. Subsequently, he decides to jump to strike the monster and momentarily distract it while he looks for his weapon, something that the dragon describes as stupid. However, both are surprised when that blow sends the monster flying. Now a new story is told. There was once a brilliant dragoness named Ephor who lived in the Ixrad realm, who was cared for and loved by the warriors who fed her. But everything changed when, one day, a fat and arrogant prince wanted to ride her like the rest of the knights, not knowing the true implications of this, which caused him to fall off the dragoness and die. This led to Ephor being sentenced to execution. But fortunately, some knights helped her escape into the forest, where she now lives, alone, with no time for anyone to ride her, as demons from another world kept coming, trying to kill her. Despite being superior to all of them, she couldn't bring herself to kill them, showing her peaceful nature. However, the warriors she defeated decided to gather to hunt her down, successfully defeating her brutally. At that moment, she learned that she couldn't show them compassion, couldn't let them live. When she finishes, it is shown that Ephor was crying in front of Ryu, telling him that it was they who left her no other choice, as they kept coming. It is revealed that she was level 27, and she explains that she wasn't really a dragon, but a heraldic, as dragons had wings on their backs, while she had her wings on her front legs. Although this last confession doesn't interest Ryu, who demands that she tell him how she knew he was a being from another world, threatening her with the sword above her head. Ephor explains that she didn't know by looking at him, but it was because their bodies disappeared when they died, and that the Rathnians rarely entered the forest, which is how she found out. Ryu considers it an assumption, and therefore he understands that no one would know he was a being from another world just by his appearance. Then, he asks her if this was the Greylet Forest, to which the dragoness replies that the Greylet Kingdom was destroyed long ago, and now the Ixrad Kingdom dominates the area, renaming the forest. With his questions answered, Ephor asks him not to kill her, as she only attacked him because he was a demon from another world. This nickname annoys Ryu, and he begins to emit a dark aura that scares Ephor even more. Therefore, crying, she clarifies that it was the goddess who called them that. Remembering his guide, the protagonist provides detailed information about who these goddesses were and about the world in general. Before this, the dragoness asks if she can go home because the blow he dealt still hurt. Although he seems reluctant, the protagonist eventually agrees, threatening to kill her if she tries to escape. As they return, Ephor proceeds to explain that humans from another world started appearing 40 years ago. Initially, Rathnians and humans lived in harmony. However, humans soon began killing Rathnians to gain experience and level up. So the stronger Rathnians joined together and created the Great Land, a group formed with the sole purpose of killing the goddesses. This was because humans, just like dragons, could easily level up by killing their opponents, and there was no way to deal with them when led by a level 100 human. So before the humans could confront the goddesses, 4 people stood up and exterminated them instantly. They were Beryl, the Sword King, Zenobia the Archmage, Garhan the Terrible, and Halion the Transcendental of Life and Death. These were the names of those who would be declared the 4 heroes of the continent. After their victory, the goddesses blessed the continent, while the earthly beings turned into demons from another world who made a contract with the evil demon god, which is why they were eliminated as soon as they arrived. Ephor finishes explaining while applying liquid medicine to her wound. At the end, Ryu stands up, menacingly, speaking aloud about how he was kidnapped out of nowhere, spent decades on a rocky mountain alone, and now that he's finally free, the entire continent is his enemy due to actions that are not his own. Nervous, Effer tries to make it clear that all this happened when she hadn't even been born yet, but Ryu ignores her and continues with his monologue, stating that he didn't care if he had to make a pact with the goddesses or become their subordinate, but he would kill the demon god and return home alive. However, he admits that he couldn't let anyone know his true identity, so he points his sword threateningly at the dragoness. Expecting the worst, Effer promises not to tell anyone, even disappearing, but her tears are not enough, and she emits a heartbreaking scream that echoes outside the cave. 5 days later, Ryu follows the instructions he was given. He leaves the forest to go to a city surrounded by a large wall, the city of Onpris, which has a high population density, and is located near the Saith Forest and a dungeon where powerful monsters reside. This proximity has led many hunters to try to get rich by exploring these sites. All of them came from the Onpris Hunters Guild, where he also needs to go. Ryu enters the place, which resembles a bar, and as soon as he is seen, everyone present is surprised by his enormous size, assuming he is someone of immense power, a veteran. However, their intrigue deepens even further when the protagonist approaches the agent of the place and tells her why he is there. He wants to become a hunter. In response, everyone places their hands on their weapons. Several days before this, when he was in the cave, Ryu asked Effer to help him, which surprised her. The protagonist explains that even if his appearance isn't suspicious, his limited knowledge, as well as his lack of equipment, could give him away, which is why he needs support. Although the dragoness is reluctant, thinking he will kill her once they're done, Ryu argues that she has also killed several humans, so she can't go to the villagers to reveal her identity, which means there's no need to kill her. Furthermore, he adds with a smile that it has been a while since he had a decent conversation with someone. This comment makes the dragoness remember the nights who shared with her, and wiping her tears, she agrees to help him. The protagonist is happy about this, and Effer tells him that the first thing he should do is change his clothes. However, when she sees Ryu starting to undress, she shouts that it is indecent, but he argues that she is also naked. He finishes undressing, to the dragoness's dismay. Then, the dragoness gives him clothes she had stored, which ends up tearing in the arms due to being too small, causing even more irritation in her. When the young man is dressed, Effer proceeds to explain essential details about the world, starting with the most obvious one. He should never undress in front of others under any circumstances. With this clear, he proceeds to tell her about the goddesses. They are rarely seen among people, whether they are humans or Rathnians, so the most effective way to get to know them was to become one of the 4 heroes of the continent, or to perform a great service for Thelher Rathna to receive their blessing. The only practical way to receive their blessing, it seems, is by becoming a hunter dedicated to fighting dungeon monsters, created by the demon god Ormphalos himself. To this, the protagonist indicates that his guide did, indeed, tell him that he needed to become a hunter if he wanted to meet the goddesses. The dragoness is confused by that word, so the protagonist invokes his guide to show it to her, only to notice that no one but him could see his system, so he proceeds to read to her what it says at Effer's request. Having done this, the dragoness tells him that, unlike other workers, hunters have a free lifestyle, so it's not unusual for them to have a high level. However, other humans have tried to become hunters before, so he needs to be careful and not get nervous. She even cut his hair, after a lot of effort, to make him look less conspicuous. Nevertheless, back in the present, while the secretary was filling out his application to become a hunter, Ryu was extremely nervous to the point that he admitted to himself that he must have had a grim appearance. Initially, when he told them that he was from the north of Campbell, just as Effer had told him, the woman treated him normally, even referring to him calmly as Eric Garoon, a fake name he had chosen not to raise suspicion. However, it was when he said he wanted to become a hunter and not just change clothes like the others that she and everyone else in the room became tense, preparing their weapons to attack him. Everyone was surprised that he wasn't a hunter yet. Ryu doesn't understand why they started suspecting him, but he chooses not to fight yet because the fact that they haven't attacked him yet makes him understand that they're not entirely sure if he is a being from another world. The woman, quite tense, asks him to place his hand on the measuring stone so they can create a verification according to the guild's rules. Ryu considers the possibility that the stone is meant to reveal whether he's human or not. He understands that he can't run away because that would be the same as confirming their suspicions, and he also doesn't want to destroy the place to stay hidden. But with no other option, he decides to place his hand on the stone, hoping to get away with it. A scene appears in which the stone apparently says that all of the protagonist's statistics are at a heroic level, and everyone present praises him while he proclaims that he will defeat the Demon King Onpris. The reality was quite different from the protagonist's imagination, because when he revealed that he was actually a level 5 swordsman, everyone started laughing out loud before going back to their usual activities, greatly confusing the protagonist. Then, the receptionist, having recovered from her laughter, explains that most people who come out of the Western Forest to register are people from another world. So if his level had been higher, everyone would have realized that Eric was actually a human, just like those beings from another world who arrive at level 20. While Ryu mentally cursed his guide for the original rules it established, and thanked for the first time that he was of a low level, the receptionist asked him for 300x for the registration, which he starts searching for in his bag. Remembering how he obtained this money, equivalent to about 3,000 yen, it was Effer who gave it to him before leaving, very reluctantly, given how difficult it was for her to get money from those who arrived in the forests. After paying, the woman gives him a small shield-shaped badge with a dragon in the center, indicating his status as a member of the Onpris Hunters Guild along with his level. The woman explains that he should return to have it updated if he believes he has leveled up. In case he loses it, he can get a copy by paying 80x. In his mind, Ryu thinks that he needs to build a name for himself in the Hunters Guild, so he directly asks the receptionist to give him a mission to explore the nearest dungeon. However, a silver-haired man in elegant clothing approaches him from behind and mocks him, saying that it's a very difficult mission for someone of his level. Mr. Laud, the receptionist, refers to this person when she asks him if he and his team are going to the Saith Forest. However, the man responds arrogantly that he heard that dungeon monsters were increasing in number and attacking nearby homes, so they will go to face them, taking advantage of their high level. Ryu sees that he is at level 27, one of the most powerful people around, but it seems like no one can stand him, and he even admits that he wouldn't like to be around Laud for too long. However, the receptionist tells the silver-haired man that there is still room in his group for one more person, so he could add Eric. The protagonist looks horrified, while she explains that it's impossible to complete missions alone, especially when it comes to entering a dungeon. Doing various jobs with Laud's group could help him learn the ins and outs of the places. To this, Laud responds that he already has someone new in the group. The person behind him removes their hood to reveal long red hair and introduces herself as Addis, a level 25 mage. However, the protagonist notices that she is actually level 37 and wonders if she has her reasons to lie about it, though he quickly looks away when he realizes that the redhead is staring at him, wondering if he raised suspicion. But just when it seemed like he had managed to avoid living with them, Laud adds that if Miss Seguri, the receptionist, asked him to, he could make room for that level 5 insect. Ryu tries to contain himself, but Laud continues to mock him and asks if he dreams of becoming the Sword King. The silver-haired man even tries to take his sword to continue his mockery, only to realize that it is much heavier than it looks, and he can't even lift it. Faced with this, the protagonist takes his sword and raises it while Laud still holds it, causing people in the room to incite them to fight. Among them, a plump bearded man says with satisfaction that he finally found him. Everyone watches this scene with a somber face, expecting the worst. The bearded man approaches and tells the protagonist that with his body, he could look after those at level 10. Laud calls him Berkeman when he sees him approaching, telling him not to get close. Hearing Berkeman's name, Ryu abandons his confrontational attitude, now wondering who that man is. Berkeman tells him that fighting is not a problem, but if he destroys the guild, then he will face everyone present. At that moment, Ryu realizes that by lifting his sword, he accidentally cut part of the place's ceiling. So he quickly lowers it, apologizing, which causes Laud to fall to the ground in the process. Then the silver-haired man begins to scold him for his behavior, pointing out that no one but him would be willing to accept a weakling at level 5. The protagonist admits that he's right, thinking that he doesn't even have money now, so he contemplates swallowing his pride and begging the other guy to accept him into his group. But before he can act, Berkeman defends him, saying that with a body like his, it would be easy to level up, and he asks if he would like to join his group. Ryu notices that Berkeman's level is something like 25, just like Laud's, and even though he might not be able to stay with the group for long due to his high growth rate as someone from another world, he understands that he still needs support to get started. So he looks at the people who would be his companions and, forgetting about Laud and his complaints, he simply expresses his gratitude for letting him join them. The city of Onpris was created especially because of the dungeons and monsters in its vicinity. Therefore, the commerce and businesses in the area are mainly based on assisting monster hunters and creating items from the materials they bring, including weapons made from monster skin. There are two main hunting areas in Onpris, the Ifan Plains Dungeon and the entrance to the Sathe Forest Zone. There are small villages near the forest, outside the city walls of Onpris, but it's rare for monsters to venture out of the forest to reach them. However, recently, the number of monsters attacking the forest's surroundings has increased, which is why several hunters have joined for a joint subjugation mission. Just as this happens in a village near Onpris, which was infested with Devalks, high-level monsters with slow mobility, but strong enough grips to crush a rock and the weight to deliver powerful attacks. One of these monsters attacks a warrior who manages to repel it with his shield. This is Berkaman Rappel, the level 25 swordsman who holds the title of Onpris' strongest tank. While the bearded man defends himself from the Devalk head-on, another one tries a sneak attack from behind, but the man reacts quickly, impaling the Devalk in the chest with his lance, although it leaves his back exposed to the Devalk he just repelled. As the monster was about to go after him, taking advantage of his distraction, a brown-haired woman with a lance jumps at him, driving her weapon into his head and killing him. This is Amber Bonnet, the lance wielder of Berkaman's team, known for her high damage output. She mockingly comments to her leader that, judging by his reaction, it's not time for him to retire yet, to which the man jokingly says that retirement sounds pretty good. However, the playful atmosphere changes abruptly when the woman sees that Berkaman has a deep wound on his arm and nervously tells him to get it treated, to which he indicates that she shouldn't worry. Amber blushes and replies that she's never been worried about him. As Berkaman gets closer to the brown-haired woman's face, his wound fully regenerates due to a spell invoked by a young girl with a ponytail. This is Erwin Rappel, Berkaman's younger sister, the spiritualist and healer of the group, who asks their leader if he's okay. Berkaman thanks her and proudly claims that he could last all day now, which increases Amber's blushing as she asks him not to die. Erwin is so focused on her brother that she doesn't notice the Devalk sneaking up on her from behind until it's about to bite her. Luckily, the girl isn't injured thanks to a spell, Fire Hammer, which drives the monster away. This power was invoked by Hubert Krudaus, an 18th level blonde-haired mage who played a defensive role in the group. Together, the four of them were the Team Berkaman, the most reliable team in Onpris, experts not only in combat, but also in coordination and balance. That's why there was no better place to be than with them, the protagonist comments while he stays away from the fight, left behind due to his low level to take care of the weaker monsters and prevent them from interfering in the battle. Despite his secondary role, they at least divided the earnings equally with him, although it remained boring. At least, he notes that things were going quite well. However, in the distance of the forest, several Devalks were scared, pointing at a red Devalk to the protagonist, saying that it was the one easily killing them. The monster was Lord Devalk, the strongest monster in the area at level 25, who approached, promising to kill them all if they lied. But as soon as it left the forest, a stone bullet pierced through its chest, killing it instantly. This was something Ryu managed to do just by throwing a rock with his finger, as he did with the rest of the Devalks coming out. Although he was the strongest monster in the area, it seemed he was of such a low level to him that he didn't even earn a single experience point. Erwin approaches the protagonist to tell him that they're done, so they can start collecting now, and Ryu mentally notes to ask Berkaman later to face higher level monsters. Next, we see the innocent Erwin slicing open the stomach of one of the Devalks to retrieve one of its organs. It was a magic stone that they could get 15x for, a price they could also obtain for the monster's skin if they skinned it. In his mind, the protagonist admits that he probably would have vomited if he had seen the scene before being kidnapped, but he had cut and eaten so many hellhounds that it was no longer so surprising. That's why it was quite easy for him to skin the Devalks, remove the important organs from their bodies, and place them in baskets within seconds, impressing the whole Berkaman team. When Erwin asks him how he became so skilled, he replies that he had been doing things like that for 20 years. This surprises Berkaman, who asks him about his age. The protagonist thinks for a moment and remembers that he hadn't aged since he arrived in Thelher Rathna, so he tells him he's 24 years old. Hesitating if it's appropriate, the bearded man now asks the protagonist what happened to his parents. With a nervous smile, Ryu answers that he was kidnapped 20 years ago, so he couldn't remember them, and it was impossible for him to return home. It's a half-truth that makes the whole group start sobbing over his tragic story, and they hug him to make it clear that he's now part of their family. Ryu only thinks that these people are quite kind, and he thanks them for letting someone of such a low level like him join them. To this, Berkman responds that levels don't matter, and he confesses that he has been at level 25 for 5 years. Amber then explains that she hasn't leveled up because there were no strong monsters, except in dungeons, and even the Devalk they just dealt with could be considered high level. They don't need to hunt stronger monsters because they would never go to places like dungeons. This leaves the protagonist shocked, realizing that being with them wasn't very useful. So, he gets up from his spot with the excuse of going to practice with his sword, to which everyone tells him to be careful not to go to the safe forest. Concerned for his well-being, Hubert even suggests accompanying him to look after him in case he encounters any monsters. However, when the mage goes to the place where the protagonist should be, he is surprised to find it empty. In reality, Ryu had gone straight to the forest and was running through the area, concerned about not finding a monster that could give him experience, as they were all at level 21 or lower. It's at this moment that he remembers a conversation he had with Effer where he questioned if she was afraid of living alone, to which she told him there was no need to be afraid, as there was no one of her level 27 in the forest. For this reason, he sits on the ground, sad about not finding a monster that could give him experience, since even the Devalks with a similar level to Effer didn't give it to him. Resigned, he decides to return to the camp with the rest of the group since it was getting late, though he still wonders what his real level is. However, a loud roar grabs his attention, and he starts running toward that area. He realizes that the monster that emitted such a sound wasn't as big as a hellhound, but he was sure it wasn't a common monster like the rest. So if he could manage to hunt it, perhaps he could level up. He shoots like a bullet to the spot, causing such a fall that it raises a small curtain of smoke. However, when he looks around, there was no monster, only Addis, the mage from Laud's group, totally naked and surprised to see him. Although he is surprised that the mage turns out to be a guy, he doesn't say anything and, not finding the monster, decides to apologize and leave, saying he'll pretend he didn't see anything. However, Addis doesn't let him go, saying he looked pretty suspicious, an accusation the protagonist thinks he has no right to make considering he was naked for no apparent reason. Despite this, he tells Addis that he came to the forest, even though it wasn't a place for a level 5, because he thought he had heard a loud sound in the area, so he believed there might be a high-level monster. Instead of calming the red-haired boy, this statement agitates him. When the protagonist is about to leave, saying that his team is probably waiting for him, the boy takes his wand and creates a wall of flames in front of him, threatening him with his weapon, demanding that he tell him if he really saw that monster he was talking about. Frustrated with his attitude, Ryu quickly approaches him and takes his wand, reiterating that he didn't even know what that sound was, and he asks why Addis and Laud were so condescending towards people with lower levels. This makes Addis reconsider his stance, saying that's not what he was trying to do, apologizing to him, excusing himself by saying he might have been a bit emotional. Suddenly, Laud arrives with his swords in hand, angry at what he sees and declaring that he has finally shown his true self. Trying to further provoke his anger, Addis places his wrist in Ryu's hand, hiding his wand, to act as if he were hurting him and asking him to let go, something that makes Ryu indignant. Laud scolds him for laying a hand on the lady of his team, making Ryu realize that he didn't even know Addis's true gender. Addis, who is also surprised by this fact, suggests that it's better to leave, as Laud is a strong magic swordsman, and the pose he was doing was a sign that he was preparing to unleash his technique, a pose that the protagonist describes as embarrassing. While Addis agrees, he clarifies that when he's in that position, he has no doubts about killing. Laud tries to make his intentions clear, but his speech is interrupted by Ryu, who asks Addis, who was trying to cover himself with a piece of cloth, to put on his clothes, something the redhead apparently had forgotten. This exchange further enraged the silver-haired man, declaring that he would show him the difference in their levels, releasing his power. However, the protagonist thinks that he didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so, without looking forward, he decides to apologize and bows down. What he didn't expect was that, as he lowered his upper body, the handle of his sword protruded in a position that pointed directly at Laud's crotch. Due to the speed at which he was moving, the silver-haired man couldn't stop, causing a heavy blow to that area that ended up causing a big explosion. That night, Ryu was sitting on a bench outside a wooden house, lamenting his actions. Berkman approaches to tell him that he knows what happened with Addis and Laud, making it clear that it wasn't his fault. However, the protagonist states that the pain he caused is something unforgivable, so the older man tries to be optimistic, saying that they should wait for the results. Then, Erwin comes out of the house to tell him that Laud's life was no longer in danger thanks to Eric bringing him quickly. However, he couldn't do anything to fix the other damages, and she starts to whimper, feeling helpless, being comforted by her brother. Ryu enters the place to see how Laud was doing, and although he made it clear he didn't like Laud, he couldn't help but feel sad for him. All the men who were there remained silent because, even though Laud was to blame, the pain and suffering he was going through was something that no one could console. The next day, Attis promised to take Laud, who was still weak, back to the city of Onpris. Along the way, he learned the truth about Attis's gender, and it was difficult for him to face him again. The protagonist couldn't find the monster that made that sound, although in the end, he forgot about it after spending 3 months with Berkeman's group. One day, while the group was training inside their tent in front of the Saith Forest, Berkeman reveals to the group that Laud had gone to the dungeon alone, something that Amber catalogued as suicide because even though Laud was of high level, he was used to fighting lower-level native monsters. In his mind, the protagonist confirms this, thinking that Efer and Devalk were the only beings of higher level, so he asks if there were different monsters in the dungeon than those found in the forests. Amber explains that originally, they are not from this world, but they are created by dungeons for the evil god Ormflaus, so it was common to encounter monsters of level 30 or higher. Faced with this, the protagonist considers the idea of going to the dungeon secretly to see if, being level 30, those monsters could help him level up. As if reading his mind, Berkeman comments that monsters weren't the only problem in the dungeon, but for several months, there have also been many warriors secretly hunting there. Ryu tries to disguise his frustration by cursing those people while remembering that the dungeon entrance selection was strict, so he better forget about it. Still, he asks if it's so dangerous, then why did Laud decide to go alone? To which Berkeman suggests that he might have done it with the hope of finding a healing artifact. Artifacts are the sources placed inside dungeons, items that come in various forms and grant different abilities. Among them is an artifact that, according to rumors, is capable of healing any wound, and it could probably cure his new condition. Furthermore, he adds that several monsters have started crawling out of Saith Forest, so he hopes this isn't a bad sign. That night, when they were in bed, Ryu thinks that these dungeons and artifacts sounded like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so, despite everything, they might be his only option to level up. So, once everyone falls asleep, our protagonist leaves the camp and ventures into the forest. He admits that, no matter how many times he has done it, he always feels a bit scared walking in the forest at night. Then he wonders if a monster should have appeared by now and considers whether he should go ask Efer where they are. Although, suddenly, he yawns, revealing that he hasn't slept much in recent months and doesn't quite remember where his house is. But in the end, it wasn't necessary to remember, as he encounters an ant monster that gets scared at seeing him so suddenly. Despite the initial shock, the monster opens its mouth, and upon closer inspection, Ryu realizes that it was quite strong. It was a level 31 Tetiro, which normally lived in dungeons and had a shell that made it resistant to sword attacks, although it was vulnerable to magic. Upon seeing these details in his guide, the protagonist admits that these were tough enemies for him, as more monsters of this kind approach to confront him. The Tetiro creatures discuss how eating him would be easy since Ryu wasn't a mage, but only had a knife. However, they are shocked when they see that with a single slash, the protagonist was able to cut one of them in half. This makes the protagonist smile and declare that his guide was lying. Despite such power, one of the Tetiros says they will confront him because the knife wouldn't hurt them. However, the protagonist, without losing his killer instinct, responds that it seemed like only he was going to confront them, pointing to his companion who had fled in terror. While the Tetiro talked about having to return to the dungeon because it was dangerous outside, the protagonist quickly catches up to him and tells him to take him with him. Terrified, the monster hides under the roots of a tree and starts digging. But this doesn't stop Ryu, who easily lifts the tree with his hands and taunts the creature, telling it that he found it. The protagonist then looks in surprise at the magical portal on the ground that the monster was trying to access, which led back to the plains of Ifin dungeon according to his guide. The protagonist assumes that the dungeon monsters expelled the native forest monsters. He draws his weapon and menacingly asks the Tetiro if they created the portal. The Tetiro responds that they didn't because they couldn't use magic, so the protagonist asks if they knew who did. Nervous, the Tetiro doesn't answer, so Ryu confesses that he thought of letting him go if he confessed, but since he wouldn't, he would destroy the portal. In response, the Tetiro stops him, confessing that he couldn't let him in as it was that person's orders. Of course, the protagonist didn't know who that person was, but he obtained all the information he needed. So he put half of his body into the portal and told the monster that, to comply with orders, he should simply act as if he hadn't seen anything. He also asks him not to let anyone else in because that person wouldn't find out anyway, though mentally, he says this would prevent others from secretly discovering him exploring the dungeons. Fully entering the portal, the Tetiro assumes that, indeed, that person wouldn't find out, and he covers the portal entrance with dirt to conceal it, saying aloud that he knows nothing, making it clear he would help the protagonists. Inside the dungeon, a red-haired boy fought against a Tetiro, using his weapon to prevent it from stabbing one of its claws into his face. Despite his unfavorable position, he shouts to his companion, Alicia, to be careful because another of these insectoid monsters was approaching her. He uses his foot to push the monster in front of him away, but seeing that it was unharmed, he wonders if magic was really his only option. On her part, the girl, also red-haired, screams in pain when the Tetiro in front of her stabs one of its claws into her leg. With tearful eyes, she recites a light incantation to blind her enemy. However, her companion, who was coming to her rescue, also receives the attack, leaving him partially blinded, seeing with only one eye. Because of this, the young man, who appeared to be the group's leader, asks another of their companions, Lord Runnel, to heal him. However, when he looks for him with his gaze, he finds the man being carried by a Tetiro, eating his head. The boy didn't know what to do. He was scared and mentally called for help. His friend was about to be killed by the Tetiro, now recovered from its vision impairment, and another of these creatures was behind him, about to attack. Then, a spray of blood scatters in the cave. This was thanks to a person who, with his sword, managed to decapitate all three Tetiros simultaneously within seconds, saving them. The boy quickly analyzes the situation and realizes that it wasn't just one attack, but that the person performed a low strike that made the Tetiros lower their claws, exposing their necks, which typically had a small opening, and allowing them to be beheaded in a second attack. This was thanks to Laud's two swords, an attack that only a magic swordsman like him could have achieved. The silver-haired protagonist asks if they were from the Onpress Hunters Guild, which the red-haired boy confirms, recognizing him instantly. This surprises Laud, who asks how he knows who he is, to which the boy explains that everyone has talked about how bravely he decided to enter the dungeon to hunt on his own. He praises him for this attitude, although Laud strikes him and shows a suspicious attitude upon hearing such comments. It turns out that Laud had been trying to survive in the dungeon for 70 days. He didn't go there voluntarily. In fact, he didn't remember how he got there. One day, he was in a bar, drowning his sorrows, and when he woke up, he was inside the dungeon. And he didn't leave simply because he never found a way out. So, although he disguises this fact, he is happy to find these kids who can help him find an exit. Alicia approaches him and mentions that she heard he had ventured into the dungeon to obtain a healing artifact to solve his problem. Even this comment surprises Laud, who didn't know such an artifact existed. Nevertheless, he tries to hide his surprise, pointing out the girl's wound. But she responds that she's okay because she managed to stop the bleeding. However, the silver-haired boy insists and takes out a potion to finish healing her. Seeing this, the red-haired boy tries to stop him, pointing out that he's using a potion high, which is extremely rare. Alicia suspects this and says that if he was trying to flirt with her because she's a girl, it wouldn't work. Laud responds that he uses it simply because she is injured, and that the cost of the potion doesn't matter as long as she is fine. However, in his mind, he states that he does it because it would be difficult for them to leave if she's injured. Despite his words, Alicia sternly tells him that she'll repay the favor once they are outside. Laud downplays it and suggests that they find an exit instead. This statement surprises the girl, who tries to defend herself, saying that she's a hunter and can take care of herself. However, Laud just asks them to find an exit, while he holds his stomach because it turns out he had irritable bowel syndrome, and it was bothering him. Nevertheless, the duo doesn't see it that way, believing that he's in pain due to his wound. Along with his use of such a valuable potion on a stranger, both boys silently admire him. Suddenly, the cave begins to tremble, and while they consider the possibility of an earthquake, Alicia explains that the dungeon is in a different dimension from the common world, so geological events like that don't occur, making a monster the most likely cause. Laud seems to confirm this, demanding that they go through the side path while he gets into an attack position. In his mind, he states that he wouldn't show weakness in front of a woman, even if he died in the process. Alicia tries to stop him, claiming that he couldn't face so many monsters, but he insists that they leave. Seeing that Alicia still had doubts, the red-haired boy takes her by the waist and runs in the direction indicated by Laud. Although the girl tries to object, their leader makes it clear that they would be nothing but a hindrance, and he couldn't allow Laud's last effort to be in vain. Laud mentally curses the boy for leaving as well when he was referring only to the girl. Although he's nervous, he assumes that he could probably handle a couple of monsters at the same time, considering that he has likely leveled up by spending so much time in the dungeon. However, his courage completely disappears when he sees that there is a sea of Tetiros heading towards him. He is more than certain that he would die within seconds against them, so he decides to scream and run. However, the Tetiros do not chase him. They are also running away from a being they consider dangerous. Therefore, they quickly pass Laud without giving him much importance. Laud is left blank, not knowing what is happening. Further ahead, a pile of Tetiros' corpses can be seen, and many more are being torn apart in a tornado of force created by none other than Ryu Hanbin, who seems quite disappointed with the place because he isn't gaining any experience by killing these monsters. He adds that it frustrates him that he can't even draw his sword for fear of collapsing the entire cave, and he states that containing his power is quite painful. On the other hand, a golden Tetiro is trying to stop two others who want to escape because of the sword-like magic approaching them. The golden Tetiro tries to encourage the others to stay, saying they are brave, so they shout at the protagonist to stop. However, he doesn't even hear their exclamation and simply tears down a wall to enter, killing the trio of monsters easily. Once freed, the protagonist notices that there is an artifact in the center of the room, a golden bracelet capable of generating fireballs. Curious, he wonders if there should be a boss guarding items like that, not knowing that it was guarded by the King Tetiro, the golden monster he killed without realizing it had a level of 40. Apart from that, he assumes that if he takes the artifact, the monsters in the dungeon will disappear, something he doesn't want to happen because he supposedly hasn't faced the boss and still wants to gain experience. However, when he reads that he could use fireballs by shouting, with a maximum of 30 uses, he takes it directly, declaring that this was every man's dream. He assumes a position and shouts to generate the fireballs. A voice begins to speak, wanting to know how the monsters continued to emerge from the dungeon was what the ancient hunters who explored the area wanted to find out. That's how they discovered that the monsters were not reproducing but were being manufactured in a special area where the magic of the place resided. The voice admits it had no idea why the source of this magic was housed in the form of items, although it knew that these hunters referred to these magical objects as artifacts. In the middle of the narration, it becomes clear that despite following the instructions, the protagonist couldn't summon any fireballs because he needed to be level 31 to use them. Apparently, the voice explains that, unlike regular tools that can be used by anyone, magical artifacts require a minimum level to use. Although for anyone, this should not be a hindrance because these levels must be minimal for beings who have come so far. Of course, in Ryu's case, who is still level 5, it is a problem, and he removes the item, calling it garbage. Although the voice declares that they had immeasurable value in the markets. Annoyed because his level brings him so many problems, he wonders if he should sell it and, if he does, whether it would be too suspicious for someone like him to have something like that. Despite everything, the voice states that it was quite unusual to see a hunter actually carrying an artifact. While commenting on this, the protagonist starts to pout and suddenly an underground door opens and the being continues explaining the reason. It seems to be the pride they had for having defeated most of the dungeon monsters up to that point, and for them to obtain an artifact just at that moment. This makes them assume the risk of the new opportunity opening up before them without thinking much, leading them into a hell without realizing it. The protagonist smiles, sure that this should lead to the boss's room. Once he goes down the stairs, he finds himself in the middle of the dungeon. Ryu admits that he would like the boss to appear quickly because he needs to return to Berkamen and the others before they wake up. However, he is disappointed to see only a lance in the middle of the room. Worried because nothing is happening, he starts shouting so that the monsters appear, warning that he will take the artifact, which would make the dungeon disappear. Just as he was about to take the item, tentacles suddenly bind his arms. The protagonist looks at the one responsible for this. It was a level 45 observer tentacle that was getting closer. Seeing it, he assumes that he might possibly gain experience from it. Although while the monster also ties his legs, he declares that he would likely receive a lot of damage if he let himself be captured by it. Suddenly, Laud enters the room, stating that he finally found the exit, but he is in shock to see Ryu, referring to him by his level. For his part, the protagonist is shocked that he has been discovered and tries to think of an excuse. The silver-haired man stops him and starts laughing manically, scaring the protagonist. Laud claims that it was obvious that Ryu was a low-level monster who used opponents' traumas and fears to shape and fight against his enemies. The protagonist plays along to avoid being discovered and acts as if he were a monster. So Laud attacks him with murderous intentions, even surprising the observer tentacle, who doesn't understand what is happening. just as this creature takes advantage of the boy approaching it to try to attack him with its tentacle without being seen. Thanks to its unidirectional body, the observer tentacle could defend itself and attack from the air without any problems. It had no blind spots. It was also super fast, so it could attack hunters in their blind spots without them noticing. 0.376 microseconds. That's how long it took the monster to reach Laud. However, it couldn't even touch him since the protagonist noticed the attack and grabbed its tentacle quickly. Although this prevented him from moving back from Laud's attack, so, seeing that he was about to attack from below, he had no other option but to jump. By doing this, he ends up hitting the observer tentacle with his own body, taking it up to the ceiling, where it hits. The protagonist admits that this attack was dangerous because if he hadn't dodged it, it would have torn his clothes. Upon returning to the ground, he wonders if the boss was pretty weak as well, while dodging a new attack from the silver-haired man. His movement causes the monster, still tied to Laud, to fall from column to column, the only one actually taking damage without doing anything. Finally, the protagonist holds his weapons with one of the tentacles that tied him, while Laud continues to shout at him. But as he yelled at him to die, Laud's skin started to darken until it turned gray. Upon closer inspection, he realizes that the monster cut the tentacles that bound him and was left behind, among a pile of rocks, taking the opportunity to bind Laud with its tentacles, taking control of him and using his body to communicate with him. Assuming that they were companions, the monster asserts that it will probably be difficult to fight with Laud, so it injects more tentacles into him. However, the boss is taken aback when the protagonist tells him that he would give him Laud's body if, in return, he gave him experience. Faced with the monster, he declares that he has changed his mind. While he originally thought of turning Laud into fertilizer for the cave, he now injects more of his tentacles, changing his morphology to make him an intermediary boss that will massacre all the humans in the area and eat them. Of course, this will make Ryu the main course, he explains as he attacks the protagonist with Laud's body. The monster admits that Ryu is strong but claims that even if he is the most powerful, he could not be so heartless as to kill another comrade. However, in the end, this clash cannot happen because the observer tentacle poorly controls Laud's body and fails in its attack. In this, he notices that the protagonist swung his sword, although he is confused about when he did it. The next thing he notices is that suddenly his vision is split. For his part, the protagonist laments that this is the full extent of a level 45's power. Seeing the whole picture, it can be seen that the tentacle that was binding Laud was cut, causing him to return to his normal form and crash into a wall. The boss monster, on the other hand, has been split in half without realizing it. Upon realizing this, the observer tentacle assumes that the wind pressure from the sword swing caused such damage. The protagonist comments that his guide didn't appear, so it seems that not even the dungeon boss was powerful enough to give him some experience. The monster declares that if someone like him exists, there is no point in even opening the portal. So before he takes the core and makes everything disappear, he needs to report to that person. For this reason, a kind of bat, his true essence comes out of his eye, and in the most cautious way, it tries to escape. But Ryu notices this and throws a stone, thinking that it might be a bug. Disappointed, he declares that it's time to go back, but suddenly he feels a vibration and shouts the number 150 million. It's morning at Berkman's team camp. While Berkman and Amber stretch outdoors, Erwin comes out of the tent to ask if they had seen Eric because they hadn't seen him since the morning. Although they suggest that maybe he went to the bathroom or something, she becomes scared, thinking that maybe he went into the forest, and a monster caught him. After this thought, she becomes frightened to see a monstrous creature behind her. She screams and turns around only to see that it's Eric, who had brought a purple fish, and he apologizes for leaving. When the girl asks him what happened, the protagonist, with a blank face, replies that nothing happened, suddenly remembering what happened in the dungeon. After defeating the true form of the observer tentacle, the guide informs him that he received 113,340 experience. Faced with this, Eric starts doing calculations. A giant demon dog gave him 258 experience, and he only needed 1,100 points to go from level 4 to level 5. So, he assumes that he would only need 2,200 to reach level 6. In that case, he believes that he must have gained several levels with that single death, so he happily checks his statistics. However, his face goes blank when he sees that he needs 54 billion points to advance to the next level. He doesn't even try to make calculations, he just starts leaving the place without changing his expression. He leaves Laud's body behind, walks through the routes he destroyed, goes through the portal that the Tetiro guarded while he was gone, who even hands him the purple fish he ended up carrying to the camp, and even eats meat with the rest of the group, never changing his expression. Finally, when he's in his bed, he declares that he's done. So, a week goes by, and Berkeman's team couldn't find another monster outside the safe forest, so they ended up returning to the city of Onpris earlier than planned. When the group is about to enter through the wall, a knight stops them, asking for permission, even though the carrier says it's a carriage for the Hunters Guild. Apparently, people could no longer enter the city normally, even if they show their guild emblem. Faced with this confusion, Berkeman tries to explain that they haven't been in the city for 3 months because they had a mission to attend to. However, when the knight sees him, his attitude changes to a more friendly one. He removes his helmet and shows that he's a friend of Berkeman, so he proceeds to jovially explain what had happened. It turns out that 5 days ago, the guild called all adventurers outside the city because the Ipan Plain dungeon had been closed. Ryu feels tense because of the heavy atmosphere that now hangs over the city, wondering if they shouldn't be celebrating because the dungeon was closed. In his mind, he reveals that he wasn't the one who closed the dungeon since, had he done so, he wouldn't have been able to use the portal, which means someone else was responsible. So he approaches Erwin to ask if he had any idea who closed the dungeon. The wizard replies that just because no one knew who closed it is why all the streets are empty because, for an adventurer, closing such a place is a great achievement. Something that only someone from another world would hide. Understanding his situation, the protagonist turns blue, expecting the worst. Although Amber comments that being discovered wasn't the worst part, it was the arrival of the Inquisitor. This was a person sent by the church to execute beings from another world, someone who could drag and torture people to obtain this information. These measures were taken because it was impossible to distinguish between beings from another world and the Rathnians, making anyone over level 20 automatically suspicious. For the protagonist, this was a quite absurd standard, although he worries about Berkeman and Amber, who exceed that level. All this makes him sad because it makes him realize that humans will never be accepted in that world. Berkeman tries to stay optimistic, saying that nothing is certain, so while they should sell the rewards they've collected for the past few weeks, starting with converting the demon stones and selling all the monster materials in Eric's backpack. In addition, he declares that with part of their earnings, they will celebrate Eric for completing his first mission, something that everyone accepts with a smile. Although it surprises Ryu, Amber will go with him to take him to the store, but the protagonist declares that he knows where it is, so he will go alone while the rest go to the guild. Before anyone could object, he starts running towards the place. Amber asks if she shouldn't follow him since he doesn't know the prices, but Berkeman says it's not necessary because, without anyone telling him, he will realize the great value of the things he's carrying now, which seems to be more than true with the big smile that the protagonist releases as he runs. In Bolton's shop, the protagonist is surprised because the old man doesn't want to buy anything. This is because the man claims that he couldn't do anything given the current situation, even though Berkeman was one of his most loyal customers. If he traded that merchandise, it would mean getting involved with them, assuming any of them is a potential being from another world. Furthermore, he adds that the only reason the city prospered was due to the Ipan Plain dungeon. Now that it's gone, it's unlikely that anyone would be interested in staying there or buying anything, especially with an Inquisitor and possibly a being from another world around. All of this is something that Ryu doesn't consider, and he becomes worried, his face turning blue. Not knowing what else to do, he tries to insist, to see if there was something he could do, like buying half of his things, or even less. But the old man remains firm, and he was going to continue his explanation about the Inquisitors when he is interrupted by the arrival of a man in a black hood and a steel mask, the Inquisitor. Of course, upon seeing him, the old man is terrified, while the Inquisitor thanks him for the quality introduction and comments on the quality items. Ryu, on the other hand, is surprised by the Inquisitor's appearance and tries to examine him closely, curious about his level. However, this being notices this and confronts the protagonist face to face. The person asks if he was confused because he couldn't see his level, and precisely, Ryu was unable to see his species or level, with inaccessible being the only thing that appeared in both sections. But the protagonist doesn't give in and says that he didn't know what he was talking about, although he was mentally taken aback by his incredible speed, closing the distance in less than a second. This leads to an exchange of questions and answers. The Inquisitor indicates that he would be considered tall, but Ryu is much taller than him, something the protagonist claims to have heard many times. The Inquisitor then directly asks why he was staring at him, to which Ryu responds by asking who wouldn't. Without giving in, he asks why Ryu didn't run if he was afraid, to which Ryu tells him that if he had, he would have followed him and been suspicious. Then the masked man asks which god he worked for, to which Ryu says he is an atheist, and the Inquisitor then asks what his favorite story is. But Ryu says he is an orphan and doesn't know any. These questions were aimed at gauging the level of misinformation Ryu had, as well as making him nervous to fail. But it seems he doesn't achieve his goal. Although the Inquisitor still comments that being a hunter who grew up as an orphan without religion is just as suspicious, so he directly calls him a being from another world. Ryu defends himself by saying that he hasn't been a hunter for long, so he wouldn't know how unusual it is for a person with characteristics like his to be around. But accusing him of being a being from another world is quite extreme. Hearing this, the Inquisitor then takes a piece of wood and says that if he really had been a hunter for a short time, his level should be low, not level 5. As he says this, the Inquisitor himself realizes that he confirmed that it's highly likely he is not a being from another world. So Ryu asks if, now that he has been investigated, he can sell his things, something the Inquisitor confirms. With no other option, the Inquisitor is about to leave the place, while Ryu continues to negotiate with the old man, who is now willing to buy from him, although it seems he will reduce the payment due to the lack of interest in the city. Although the man doesn't make an offer as he focuses on a special object, the bracelet that shoots fireballs. Despite having appeared calm and confident, Ryu admits in his mind that he is quite scared. The old man asks if he's selling the artifact, but the protagonist refuses because he knows the implications of having it, and quickly tries to take it off. However, due to his nervousness, he makes the item fall and roll right next to the Inquisitor. The person takes the relic, while asking Ryu how he will explain that, how he explains that he, a level 5, has an artifact. The old man flees from the store in fear, claiming that he doesn't know anything, while Ryu wonders what he should do. Despite the aura of danger he exudes, the Inquisitor admits that it's impossible for a level 5 to have gone to a dungeon, so he simply gives the item back, telling him to take care of it because it's very valuable. Furthermore, he whispers a piece of advice in Ryu's ear. Then he tells Ryu a story from 15 years ago. A married couple lived in a small village. The man was a veteran hunter and, although he wasn't a group leader, he was quite beloved by many people. One day, on a mission with his team, the man became very frightened of a seemingly weak-looking monster. Of course, his comrades didn't understand his behavior and were about to attack the monster, so the man had to confess. He was a being from another world, and that seemingly weak monster was, in reality, level 80. Although he managed to convince them not to attack, the monster found them. So, to buy some time, the man let his dear comrades escape while he faced the monster. At that moment, the Inquisitor asks Ryu whom he thought had died in that situation, to which the protagonist replies that he was probably the being from another world whose identity was discovered. However, the Inquisitor responds that besides the leader of that group and the being from another world, everyone else related to the human was massacred. This was because the leader exposed the heretic Inquisitors to the human, which is why he was the only one they didn't kill. However, the rest of the people died while they were under investigation for collaborating with the being from another world. The being from another world miraculously survived his battle with the level 80 monster and returned home. However, no one was there to welcome him because the villagers burned his house and murdered his family, impaling them as punishment for lying to him. In retaliation, the being from another world killed every person in that village before leaving forever. Finishing his story, the Inquisitor makes it clear to Ryu that anyone who is related to a being from another world is destined to suffer great misfortunes. The protagonist asks him the reason for telling him that, to which the hooded figure replies that it's common for beings from another world to use innocent hunters to get rid of valuable artifacts. For this reason, he decides to turn a blind eye this time, choosing to advise him to be careful, although he still asks him to tell him which group he belongs to. This question angers Ryu, who, picturing the corpses of Berkaman and the others, throws a punch at the Inquisitor, ready to kill him. However, someone intervenes, causing him to stop his attack halfway. It was Addis who, with a bow, apologizes to the Inquisitor, saying that he has misunderstood things and has come to clarify them. Ryu tells him that what he did was dangerous, referring to getting in the middle. However, the redhead starts insulting him, shouting that he should never have given him the artifact, which leaves Ryu confused, and the Inquisitor himself, who asks the redhead who he is. After calling the protagonist a muscle-bound insect, which makes him sad, he introduces himself to the man as Addis Bannister, the 37th head of the Bannister family. Curiously, the Inquisitor recognizes him as the dragon hunter from the Bannister family and confesses that he thought their lineage had become extinct, although his amulet seems to prove otherwise. Addis admits that, even though he's weak, he's doing his best to revive his family. The Inquisitor apologizes for not removing his mask as he was on duty and proceeds to ask about his relationship with Eric. Addis lies, saying that he has been working as his bag boy for a few days, so he's not very familiar with the place. Upon hearing this, Ryu finally realizes that the redhead was trying to help him when he was in trouble. Addis continues by saying that he was the one who gave him the magical artifact to bring and investigate it, which brings them to where they are now, a statement that seems to convince the Inquisitor. To assist, Ryu puts on a solemn, rather unusual expression and apologizes for his incompetence. To prevent him from ruining it, Addis pushes Ryu to leave, arguing that there was still much to investigate, and bids farewell to the Inquisitor, saying, "May the blessings of darkness be with you," to which the masked man responds in kind, but he watches them as they go. When they are at a safe distance, Ryu thanks Addis, to which he only tells him never to try to act again. The protagonist questions if he doesn't even want to know why he has an artifact because he might be a strange person. The redhead refuses, arguing that Ryu didn't ask him anything when he was in the forest, so he could be a strange person too. Mockingly, the protagonist says that, in any case, he always saw him as quite strange, an opinion that Addis also shares about him. But just as they were about to leave, the Inquisitor asks them what the artifact's ability is. Of course, Ryu was going to say that it's to generate fireballs, while Addis was about to lie, saying it was electricity. Faced with this, both of them stop mid-sentence and look at each other, terrified of contradicting themselves. This is enough for the Inquisitor, who activates an ability that starts generating a gust of wind while apologizing, asking both of them to come with him. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here. So comment the word sword in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.